Hi, my name is Jacob Ansari, and I'm the CISO for Shellman and Company, an independent audit and attest firm. And so I want to talk about what security audits have been like over the last year or so. Since our firm performs a variety of different kinds of audit and assessment types, and we've been, like everybody, pretty significantly impacted by COVID-19 and remote work and everything that's transpired over the last year or so, where we've had to adapt just like everybody else to meet our clients' needs because security audit needs didn't go away, and security audits and security assessments continued to happen in 2020, even despite what's gone on. And so in summary, we had to sort of adapt how we did things, at least a little bit, and our clients had to adapt as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Along the way, I think we learned some interesting lessons. Some were very surprising, and some were maybe not so much. And I'll talk about some of the lessons that we've learned. And then I'll talk about what I think is maybe going to persist after we're all vaccinated and protected against the current pandemic, because I don't think anybody believes that we're going back to what it was like before. So perhaps the first thing that's worth pointing out about security assessments or security audits over the last year is that a lot of the governing bodies that dictate the standards or drive the standards that we assess against made accommodations for remote work really without too much fuss. For example, the PCI SSC, which governs the PCI standards, published a number of pieces of guidance over the last year, allowing for remote assessment work with the phrase essentially obtaining the equivalent assurances that you would gain from an on-site assessment. For our ISO practice, where we do a lot of ISO 27001 and ISO 27701 and similar standards, there were exceptions made for the sort of very specific kind of on-site time requirements to allow for remote work during the pandemic. This did, in fact, require some fairly specific exception documentation that our teams had to complete for all of our ISO projects, and I believe are still working on this year. And then the A2LA governing body, which governs our FedRAMP practice, made very specific allowances for remote audit work in lieu of their otherwise fairly specific needs for on-site efforts. So by and large, the standards bodies were very accommodating and very understanding of the needs to allow for remote audit where that was necessary. But that said, a number of things changed about our audit practice, and there are some that were really obvious, and I'll move through those, and some were a little more subtle. Obviously, we didn't travel, we didn't go on site. And we had to figure out how to do all of our observations remotely over screen sharing or over sort of asymmetric kind of evidence capture methods. And all of our conversations, our interviews, and our discussions with our clients moved to Zoom or similar web conferencing software. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a number of procedures are more difficult to test remotely. Some things I think are fairly obvious, like physical security controls, and other cases involved like widely distributed sorts of environments. Think of a retail location with a number of stores, or a retail entity with a number of stores over a large geography. If you're doing a PCI DSS assessment for this kind of entity, you probably have to look at the point of interaction, right? The card reader device at the register. And getting access to those devices, or getting somebody to show you the configurations of those devices over a remote connection was challenging. And then there were a few standards, I'd say particularly under the PCI umbrella, that dealt with some cryptographic operations that really didn't allow for this. This mostly involved specific kind of cryptographic key operations, usually under like the PCI PIN or the PCI PDP standard. I'll talk about this a little bit in a few moments. Other things that were maybe not so surprising were that the remote work issues that appear in other lines of work, right, that affect everybody, affected our teams and our clients as well. Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. I think we're all sort of tired of it, and it affects security assessments and audit work not any less than anybody else. And managing projects across different time zones with clients and colleagues gets tiresome and troublesome, and that's true of a lot of different kinds of work, and it's not, again, any less true here. I'd say some organizations that have a very global reach and have or have outsourced functions that are relevant to the audit that occur in time zones that are significantly different from the time zones where our team members reside. Those got challenging to schedule things that made that could work, but again, that's a thing that a lot of different kinds of organizations have had to experience. One thing that surprised us was a few very occasional bright spots in remote, in all remote kind of audit work. A few of our clients took to this sort of surprisingly. I spoke to one of our managers in our FedRAMP practice in putting this presentation together, and he described a few of his clients that really leaned into this and said, we're gonna clear the deck of all of our distractions, and we're gonna stack all of the meetings together, and we're gonna just power through this thing and get it done. And so they were doing like 2 like long full days of Zoom meetings and accomplishing as much as they would in 4 days of on-site time. And so for a few of these clients, they were super efficient and got through a lot of things very quickly. Excuse me, but I need to stress that is a relative rarity versus the total number of audits that we did. Pardon. So a few changes were more subtle and not as expected or as clear cut. Most of our assessment work, most of our audit work, saw a fairly substantial drop in efficiency. And very much so in excess of whatever savings we realized on travel costs, or whatever savings our clients realized on travel costs. I mean, certainly we all emitted many fewer tons of greenhouse gases in 2020, and that's important. But the idea that assessment work would be sort of net cheaper because we weren't buying airline tickets or staying in hotels or things like that simply didn't pan out, right? And some of these efficiency penalties or some of these efficiency reductions, really apply to kind of both parties in a security assessment. So this isn't me throwing shade at our clients or anything like that, because it's very easy for either party, right, or for both, to not prepare adequately for any sort of scheduled event in the audit. For, I suppose, a variety of psychological and logistical factors. If somebody is coming to your office space to do a security assessment, you at least want to put sort of the minimum effort into being ready for this. Whereas if you're just showing up for a Zoom meeting, it's very easy to not really have anything ready and not be ready to discuss it and not have sort of any substance and just respond to all of the inquiries with kind of the I'll get back to yous, or let me make a note of that, or let me chase that down with my team. And that sort of snowballs very quickly. And so too many of those kind of kill the schedule and push the project out and very badly affect sort of the overall timeline of things. Some technical evidence is more sort of laborious to review, typically where it involves a mix of sort of the technology and the process, like observing what a client does with reviewing their audit log data and how they respond to it. And then some discussions are sometimes more difficult to have remotely. If you're trying to get an entire software development team to talk about their software security practices, If everybody's dialing in from wherever they happen to be, and that's spread across a couple of time zones or the like, that can be really challenging, or at least more so than getting everybody together in the conference room to talk through it in kind of a in-person setting. That said, one of the things we found was that assessing physical security controls went surprisingly well. I mean, it definitely was more challenging in some ways than being able to go on site, but it wound up being, I think, far less challenging than we were all sort of expecting. And to the credit of a lot of organizations, our clients' third-party co-location facilities were sort of delightfully cooperative for the most part. And we're very happy to do sort of the remote video kind of observation where they would join the Zoom meeting from their mobile device and walk through the facility and pan the camera on their phone to the things that we needed to see and show us what we needed. And that worked, I'd say, surprisingly well once you got past that kind of Blair Witch Project sensation of the shaky cam showing you the data center. And there were a few variations on this theme. In some places, the co-location facility didn't really have cell signal or Wi-Fi because it was under a mountain. And what our clients did, or what the colo did, was pre-record that. The data center personnel or the facilities personnel would walk through and record what they were doing and what they were showing us, and they would sort of submit that recording to us, and then we just sort of gave them the disclaimer that we may ask them to go back and get specific things that weren't visible in their initial recording. Like, hey, go back to this point at 2 minutes and 37 seconds where you were, and then pan left 30 degrees and show us what's there. And by and large, it really didn't even have to come to that. And this worked very well. There was, I would say, a small minority of facilities who would not play ball, who insisted on their sort of no video recording inside the data center policies and wouldn't make exceptions even for these circumstances. And in those cases, there were times where we couldn't test the requirements. We could not evaluate the physical security controls. And then we had to disclose that in the report. And in some cases, that sort of not tested or not assessed quality ended up as a disclosure, and in some cases that affected sort of the compliance status of things, because some standards essentially regard that as such. So that did happen, and that did have some trouble, but it was very much a minority of facilities that we had to contend with over the last year. There were a few cases where the remote audit work kind of didn't work at all. Again, these are those kind of long tail PCI standards like PIN or 3DS or point-to-point encryption, and typically pertain to facilities with secure cryptographic keying operations. In some cases, the requirements in those standards themselves disallow remote video or disallow video that could observe the keying material or the credentials to get access to the secure cryptographic devices. And so the act of performing kind of the remote assessment work violated the requirements that were to be assessed. So you got stuck in this kind of catch-22 there. And in those cases, we had to actually go to the facilities and we had to make some fairly careful plans to try to minimize the risk to the folks involved. Advantageously, most of these situations could be rendered down to even less than sort of a full day on site, typically just a handful of hours to go observe the relevant operations in that sort of secure key injection space. And what I say here in the slide sounds kind of barbaric, right? We send the young, healthy people, but really what that means is we sent the people who did not have themselves a number of additional risk factors, and whose sort of immediate families or people that they lived with or came into contact with regularly did not have those additional risk factors. So we weren't putting anybody in a position where they were worried about potentially contracting the virus and then coming home and passing that to somebody who was vulnerable. And this was a relatively rare set of occurrences, so this wasn't a particularly common thing. several of our team members and our clients talked a lot about the lack of in-person interactions. Everyone is sort of feeling that, right? And that's, I think, not surprising, right? Everyone everywhere is feeling that lack of in-person interactions, right? We miss good coffee bars. We miss good noodle joints. We miss being able to go someplace else and have a change of scenery and have a change of pace. And that's a real factor. And then a combination of other factors make some of this more tiring than maybe it's been under other circumstances. The idea of project stack, where one project sort of spills into the time allocated for another, and then those two spill into the time allocated for a third, it's always been a real thing that's always required very specific sort of management to mitigate, but it's even easier and sort of more palpable than before. And of course, everybody's dealing with a variety of outside pressures. Folks have gotten sick themselves. Folks have lost loved ones. Folks have had, a number of other hard things in their life that have occurred over the last year, and that matters. And the resulting sort of burnout is a very real potential thing that can happen. So there's sort of one hand where these factors are very real, and it's almost not even on the other hand, right? But the other set of facts that we have to sort of consider is that for whatever reason, this has not necessarily caused a noticeable effect in business agreements, right? Clients renewed with us. New clients came in. A few tried to negotiate, reduced fees given some financial hardships, and that was, I think, understandable. But the idea that we're going to lose a ton of business because our clients are cutting back or the like really didn't materialize, and it really didn't seem to be the case where clients or prospective clients all decided, oh well, it's all over Zoom, so everybody's the same, so let's go pick the cheapest auditor, right? That just didn't happen. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about kind of the evidence gathering process, because this changed a reasonably good bit as a result of the events of the last year. But in some ways, it's just kind of been the reckoning that's been coming for a long time. In a lot of ways, we've been gathering sort of technical evidence for security assessments remotely for a long time, right? If a system is co-located and accessed remotely or lives in a public cloud and you're accessing it through the cloud provider's console, then that evidence gathering is remote. And it has been for a long time. And it requires, I think, the appropriate level of suspicion. And to that end, I think about evidence, or I've kind of named the properties that you want to think about evidence gathering as authenticity and currency and completeness. And I'll talk about sort of what I mean with each of these. So when we think about authenticity, it's not just, is the client sort of lying to us, right? Is this the real firewall rules, or are these photoshopped, or what have you, right? Like it's, I suppose that's a problem, but that's actually not the thing that manifests itself the most often. But it's the idea that you have to question whether or not what they're giving you addresses the audit requirement, right? That does this address the thing that we need to consider as part of this requirement or part of this section of the standard, or what have you. And that's always been here, but it became sort of more pronounced over the last year. And then there's sort of the age-old question of, can an outside party possessed of sort of the relevant skills and knowledge kind of follow the evidence to arrive at the same conclusion as the auditor, right? And so the trouble tends to manifest over the sort of back and forth that occurs when there's disagreement about the sufficiency of audit evidence, right? And it leads to some kind of decay in the quality of what you get, or the authenticity or the traceability, right? So, the client gives some server configurations or some patch lists, and then the auditor says, well, this is missing things, or it's insufficient, or you're missing certain patches. And then the client responds with sort of okay, well, here's the little like incremental piece that shows you what you need. And the auditor says, well, it's part of it, but not the whole thing. And the sort of back and forth of that I mean, is often frustrating for a variety of parties, and very often boils down to the just tell me what you want and I'll get it to you, and that often is sort of a very narrow kind of thing. That then when you go back and look at it weeks or months later, or somebody else comes along to look at it and says, "How did you arrive at this conclusion?" You sometimes have kind of lost the forest from the trees, and you can't necessarily draw all of the same conclusions, at least not without a lot of very specific context that maybe nobody remembers anymore. And so really the idea of authenticity here, right, is to say, how do we receive evidence from you, right, our client, to validate this particular requirement, or to demonstrate this particular part of compliance, that has both the substance of this is authentic, this is showing us what we need, right? This is the thing that demonstrates the requirement, and it possesses the appearance thereof, right? So that nobody can come and say, well, maybe your conclusions are correct, but it's also possible to have drawn some other conclusions, right? Like it puts everybody above suspicion. The next sort of thing that I think about for the sufficiency of evidence is the idea of currency, right? Is this current? Is this recycled from last year, right? Are these screen prints that you took of these server configurations and pasted into the Word doc and provided to me, are they last year's, right? Can you tell? Or maybe they're not last year's, right? Maybe they're just from a couple of months ago, right? Maybe this is what you gave the folks when they were doing the SOC 2 audit a few months ago, and now we're doing a FedRAMP or a PCI DSS audit, and you're giving us the same thing. And it's not even that those were sort of insufficiently authentic. That really was what the state of those systems were at the time. But now this is some months later, right? Or this is some period of time later, and maybe the underlying circumstances have changed. Maybe this set of screen captures that you provided is no longer representative of the current state, right? And certain kinds of evidence sort of ages out more quickly than others, right? Server configurations or firewall rules or log data or things like that, I think have a pretty short half-life and decay pretty quickly. Obviously, things like policy documents tend to have a longer lifespan, right? And really, even like the physical evidence showing, physical security of data centers has potentially a longer lifespan, right? Or it's less likely to sort of decay into an unrepresentative state as quickly as other things. So part of what we look for here are kind of the adequate timestamps, right? If it's a screen capture of a server configuration or something like that, can we see the clock in the sys tray or in the corner to say, okay, this was when this was produced, right? It's very clearly not last year's or last month's or whatever, right? It's a usefully current piece of evidence demonstrating what we're looking for. Or if it's a document, is there a revision date, or was this thing last sort of cracked open and revised by somebody or approved by management in 2018? And sometimes this works well, sometimes this is more troublesome, right? Like certain views of audit log evidence or maybe patches or something like that, maybe they don't always lend themselves well to time stamping or an adequate sort of dating ability. And so maybe you need to undertake some additional procedures to be able to say, this is how we validate the currency of this. This is how we make sure that this is the real thing and not something that's stale or problematic. And then the last piece I want to talk about is sort of completeness. And that's, I think, fairly straightforward. The idea of, does this show everything that we need, right? Does this show the list of patches applied to some of the system types in the scope of the audit, or does it show all of the system types in the scope of the audit, right? It's very easy. I mean, again, if you're suffering from Zoom fatigue and Project Stack and other aspects of your life are kind of on fire, right? It's very easy to say, okay, well, here's the kind of list of Windows patches applied to these servers, but then neglect the handful of Linux systems or network devices or other appliances in the environment that also need a list of patches that's going to be a distinct thing. And then does it show the appropriate context? Does it show, again, like the complete list of potential system types? Or does it show kind of all of the topology pieces in the environment? Or does it show all of the applications that are in scope? Or is it sort of selective, maybe inadvertently selective, in such a way that gives the appearance of completeness without actually the substance of it? All right, so when we think about how do we do this in practice, really the core thing that makes these kinds of audits and assessments work is really, really careful planning. Some of these are just good courtesy kind of logistics things, right? Figure out when your time zones overlap or when they are sort of the least at odds, and plan your meetings accordingly, right? So maybe don't plan an 8 a.m. Eastern time meeting when half the team is on the West Coast of the United States, right? Or if you've got folks in Asia Pac and you've got folks in Europe, right? Then everybody's going to have to be inconvenienced at least some of the time. And so let's figure out how to maybe alternate that so that it's not always one team or the other that's having calls at midnight. And then it's also worth kind of figuring out your strategy for scheduling some of these things, right? And you can either try to sort of spread out your meetings to avoid that sort of back-to-back, jump from one Zoom meeting to the next, where everybody feels sort of harried and exhausted and ill-prepared for the thing that they're doing, or do what worked for my colleague in our federal services practice with a couple of his clients, and go for broke and just put it all into a couple of days, condense it all together, and power it out, right? Obviously, this latter strategy requires buy-in from sort of everybody that's going to be involved in it. And if you're the security assessor and you know your client can't reasonably handle that, they can't clear out all their distractions, they can't focus just on this, don't suggest it, right? Because you know how it's going to go. The other sort of logistical thing is to keep track of your evidence age, right? As you gather things, as you collect stuff from clients and review it and disposition it to meet the requirements or not, consider how long it is good for, right? If a client gives you a firewall rule set on the front side of the assessment and you look at it and you say, this looks pretty good, but then the assessment drags out for several months, has that essentially aged out for the purposes of the assurances that you need? Consider that, right? And maybe you need to give yourself sort of a flag or a reminder to say, hey, we're getting to the end of the useful life of this thing that you gave us at the beginning of the audit, right? Maybe we need to revisit this, or maybe we need to figure out how to pick up the pace a little bit so we don't have the sort of rocket fuel problem of evidence aging out and needing to be recollected. I'd say when you're potentially looking at some technical evidence pieces, particularly as you scale it over, potentially a large sample of systems, do a pilot first, right? If you've got a set of server configurations that you want from a client's, Linux server environment, right? We want these config files, we want the output of these commands, and then we want it across these 40 servers. Do it on one or two first and make sure that what you get back from them is sufficient, is what you want it to be, right? Because if you say, I'll go run this on all 40 servers, and they do, and they gather it all, and they put it into zip files, and they hand it back to you, and you look at it, and you're like, it's close, but you missed these things, right? They're not going to be really happy about having to go redo all of that. So pilot your sort of evidence gathering strategies accordingly. All right, so as we think about kind of the new normal, most audit types will revert to on-site work. Most will go back to this probably by the end of this year or the beginning of next. And the different standards bodies will have their requirements to do so. What's likely to happen, though, is that the amount of time you spend on site is likely to go down, right? More organizations are saying, hey, remote work is here to stay. More teams are distributed. Right? How can we condense this to be more efficient? So you should start planning on that, right? Both if you're a security auditor and if you're the recipient of a security audit or security assessment, to say, how do I accommodate sort of all parties here to focus on what's most essential, right? What needs to be on site. That might be physical security controls. That might be the evidence where the context matters the most, or where it's the easiest to sort of misinterpret, or just the kinds of discussions where getting the whole team physically present is the most productive. And then figure out, how you're going to make the best use of remote work, right? There are an increasing number of distributed teams that are not coming back to the office. And so figuring out how to work together with them to say, hey, how do we review the security process when it's spread out amongst 5 or 6 people that live in 5 or 6 different geographies? You're going to need to come together with that anyhow, right? And as more organizations make use of more cloud services, the reality of remote assessment becomes more prominent. So as we've looked at this year, what we've found is that most of our clients don't even want on-site work in 2021, right? Some because they've moved to more remote workforce, or some because they are still contending with the sort of health risks and the timetable for immunization and the assurances that they've given their own employees about continuing to be able to work remotely. And there are a number of other incentives to consider, right? Obviously, more remote work means less air travel, which means fewer greenhouse gases. And I think that's generally a good thing, right? And there's also the idea of how can we be more resilient against potential future pandemics or similar, adverse effects. And so, I think there are going to be some changes that arise as a result of this to audit practice. There's a new version of PCI DSS that's scheduled for release at the end of this year. One of its major aspects is what's called the customized approach, which allows clients to define their own controls to meet the objective, right? So they can define a thing to achieve an objective rather than meet a very prescriptive control, and then the assessor determines the test procedure. So there's a lot of flexibility in this approach, and a lot of potential for remote assessment procedures here as a result. Audit practice, I think, has changed for a lot of organizations in the sense that they've already adjusted their methods and are unlikely to sort of return, right? Everybody wants to maybe go someplace else, but you don't have to look back too far to remember living out of a suitcase and not being super thrilled about that all the time. And again, the changes in technology, more cloud-based services, more software as a service, lends itself to this kind of remote practice, right? Both for assessors and auditors and for our clients. So as you think about upcoming security audits, preparation begins now, right? Planning is even more important. So when we want to start thinking about when do these activities occur, right? And who does what and when do they do it, and how do you track that, and how do you hold all parties accountable to say, hey, this was the schedule, right? We need to stick to it, right? Or this is the schedule and you didn't stick to it, and here's now what shakes out. As well as just being able to adjust for inevitable disruptions, right? I think one of the things we've all learned in the last year is to sort of be patient with one another as you're contending with, things that happen in life. And so having some capacity both to hold people to account and to sort of cut some slack when it's, hey, there was this personal matter that arose and it really, threw me off for a week. Like, that matters. So when you think about this, obviously, step one is to show up prepared, right? Both parties be prepared for upcoming audit work, right? saying we're gonna identify what we need on site isn't gonna work. Saying we're going to respond to the audit needs as it arises is not going to work. You need to be able to make a real plan for what needs to happen and then stick to it, right? Honestly, better planning gives you more flexibility, more ability to adjust, not less. I think Charles de Gaulle said that in planning for the unknown, I find the plans practically useless, but the preparation indispensable. And that, I think, has proven itself very true over the last year. And then make sort of the best use of kind of your time in between security audits, right? Most security standards kind of require ongoing compliance activities, right? That's true of SOC, where you need a functional review period leading up to your SOC audit. If you're undergoing an ISO 27001 audit, your information security management system needs kind of ongoing maintenance and review. PCI DSS is very much leaning into the sort of business as usual set of activities, the ongoing acts of maintaining compliance. And what it means is that you need a regular schedule of security and compliance related activities to occur on their set intervals, and not just try to scrape it all together the week before your auditor shows up, right? Trying to do that is not going to get you into the desired state for your compliance, right? That kind of personal heroics isn't going to work. So if you get a security audit, or you get maybe multiple security audits, my piece of advice to you is start talking to your auditor now about planning, right? Maybe even sooner than you normally would, but start talking about the plans for when that's going to occur, what needs to happen, and how you're going to be ready for that, how you're going to adjust. Identify, the things that you really need to work on to be ready, right? And then execute on that with your team over the next couple of months. And then figure out how your team can sort of best support your audit requirements, right? And that may be figuring out how to accommodate your different time zones, and that may be figuring out your remote meeting needs and usage, and then maybe working with your auditor to figure out how you're going to exchange data, right? Or even how you're going to exchange data relevant to the audit internally. And if you are a security auditor, my advice is to contact your clients, right? Start planning. Start looking at the things that are coming up in the next 6 months and making the plans to get them sort of a clear project schedule and how to execute on that in a way that sticks to it and gets everybody sort of the desired results in the time frame that they want. And then also think strongly about what's going to keep your team from burning out, right? How you're going to sort of minimize their Zoom fatigue or their project stack or their concurrence, or just cut them some slack when they've had a lot of really challenging assessment work and they're sort of taxed by that. But those are the things that you definitely want to start preparing for in order to make this year's set of remote audits a success. So I'll conclude by saying these things are very much here to stay, and it's best to be ready for them with some careful planning. And thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your time.